In the heart of Atlanta, Pastor Joseph Williams had built a life of respect and devotion. He was the leader of a growing church, loved by his congregation, and a devoted husband and father. His life seemed perfect. Joseph's wife, Angela, was a gentle soul, a woman who stood by him through thick and thin. They had been married for 15 years and had 4 children, each one seemingly a perfect reflection of their love. However, things began to change. Joseph had always been a man of deep faith, but recent doubts about his family began to creep in. It wasn't a specific moment that triggered the suspicion, but rather an accumulation of small things. Angela had become distant, often working late or leaving the house for long hours. The children, once his pride and joy, seemed to act in ways that didn't quite add up to him. He wondered if he was simply being paranoid, but the feeling gnawed at him. His world came crashing down one day when he received the results of a DNA test he had secretly ordered. Joseph, ever the cautious man, had suspected something was off for a while. He knew that getting the truth could shatter everything, but he couldn't stop himself. The results came back, and what they revealed was nothing short of catastrophic. The test showed that none of his 4 children were his biological offspring. Each one, from the youngest to the eldest, had a different father. Joseph's heart sank as he stared at the results. The realization was like a cold slap in the face. The man he had trusted for over a decade, the woman he loved, had betrayed him. But there was more. The DNA revealed that the biological father of his children was none other than another pastor in the city, Pastor Richard Thomas. Joseph had known Richard for years. He had always seen him as a colleague, someone who shared his passion for spreading the word. But now he saw Richard as a traitor, someone who had taken what was his, someone who had been living a secret life with his wife. The betrayal cut deeper than Joseph could ever explain. In a blind rage, Joseph confronted Angela. The scene was heated, filled with anger and tears. Angela confessed, but she begged for his forgiveness, claiming that it was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness. She swore she had never stopped loving him, and that the children were still his in every way that mattered. But Joseph's mind couldn't accept that. The shock of the revelation, the image of his children not being his own, clouded his judgment. He felt lost, betrayed, and humiliated. His thoughts were clouded by a mix of anger, hurt, and a deep sense of inadequacy. It wasn't long before things escalated. Angela, frightened by his unpredictable rage, attempted to leave, but Joseph stopped her. In a fit of uncontrollable fury, he made a terrible decision. He attacked her. What followed was a horrific scene. Angela screamed, but it was no use. Joseph's anger overtook him. He grabbed a kitchen knife, the same knife he had used to prepare their family dinners, and in his madness, he struck her. The initial blow stunned Angela, but she fought back, desperate to save herself. However, Joseph, fueled by his anger and betrayal, kept attacking. The rage that had built up inside him for so long erupted in one final, brutal act. Angela was dead, but Joseph wasn't done. In his deranged state, he began to dismember her body. It wasn't just about murder. It was about erasing her, erasing the evidence of his torment. The act was horrific and calculated, though he would later claim he was acting on impulse. He cut her into pieces, cleaning up as best as he could, trying to cover his tracks. As he looked at the remains, he felt no sense of relief, no sense of justice, only emptiness. His life, his family, his church, everything he had worked for had been shattered in one single moment of madness. And as the blood dried on his hands, he realized there was no going back. The murder was messy, and as he tried to conceal it, Joseph could feel the weight of his actions bearing down on him. Little did he know, someone would be looking for the truth, and that someone was Detective Linda Harris. Detective Linda Harris was a seasoned investigator, known for her sharp mind and methodical approach to solving cases. She had seen her fair share of gruesome murders, but the case that landed on her desk next would turn out to be unlike any she had encountered before. The body of Angela Williams was discovered by a neighbor who became suspicious after not seeing her for several days. The neighbor, an elderly woman who lived next door, had stopped by to check on Angela and found the door unlocked. When she entered, she was hit with the smell of decay and saw the dismembered remains of the woman she once knew. The scene was horrific. Parts of Angela's body were scattered throughout the house, concealed in plastic bags and hidden in various places. But the brutality of it was unmistakable. Detective Harris was called in immediately. As she walked into the Williams home, she could feel the weight of the case. The home that once seemed warm and full of life now felt cold and empty. Everything was still, too still. It didn't take long for Linda to assess the situation. The crime scene was meticulously chaotic, as if the killer had been in a rush but tried to cover his tracks. The first thing she noticed was the blood. It was everywhere, not just in one room, but spread across several areas of the house, particularly the kitchen and the master bedroom. The brutality of the dismemberment was clear. Whoever had committed this crime had known exactly what they were doing. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting that the killer was someone Angela knew, perhaps even trusted. Detective Harris started the investigation by speaking with neighbors and close acquaintances of the Williams family. Everyone who knew Joseph and Angela described them as the perfect couple. Joseph was a respected pastor, admired by his congregation. Angela was a quiet, kind woman who devoted her life to her family and her church. No one had seen any signs of trouble in their marriage. No one had suspected infidelity. This made the crime even more puzzling. The investigation team scoured the house for evidence, but Linda had a nagging feeling that they were missing something. The crime seemed personal. Too personal for it to be a random act. There had to be a deeper story beneath the surface. The breakthrough came when Linda found Angela's phone hidden inside a drawer. The device was locked, but a quick search through Angela's contacts and messages revealed a trail of communication that painted a disturbing picture. There were messages between Angela and a man named Richard Thomas, Pastor Richard Thomas. Linda's heart sank as she realized the name. She had heard of him. He was another pastor in the area, well known and highly respected, just like Joseph. But why would Angela be communicating so frequently with him? And what was the nature of their relationship? Linda went through the messages carefully. At first, they seemed innocuous, general texts about church events and updates. But then, the tone began to shift. There were several messages that seemed much more personal, almost flirtatious. There were references to private meetings, late-night talks, and moments shared outside of their public lives. Linda's instincts told her that there was more to this than a simple affair. The relationship between Angela and Richard seemed to go deeper, and the discovery of Pastor Richard's involvement raised even more questions. Linda's first move was to bring Richard in for questioning. When they found him at his church, he appeared calm and collected, almost too calm. Richard denied any involvement in Angela's death. He claimed that he had nothing to do with the murder and that Angela had been nothing more than a friend and fellow church leader. He insisted that he had not seen her in over a week and was unaware of any problems between her and Joseph. But Linda wasn't convinced. She had been around long enough to read people's faces and body language, and Richard's responses didn't add up. His eyes darted around the room, his words were inconsistent, and he avoided answering direct questions. When asked about his relationship with Angela, he became defensive, claiming that any communication between them was purely professional. Linda decided to dig deeper into Richard's background. What she found was a trail of secrets. He had been married for years with a family of his own, yet there were whispers of affairs and personal issues that he had managed to keep hidden from the public eye. The more Linda uncovered, the more the pieces began to fit together. Angela had been one of several women Richard had been involved with, but there was one detail that stood out. Richard had been the biological father of all four of Joseph's children. The discovery sent a chill down Linda's spine. She knew that this revelation could be the key to understanding Joseph's actions. The sun had barely risen when Detective Linda Harris arrived at the Williams church. Joseph Williams had been arrested the previous evening and was now sitting in an interrogation room at the police station. His stoic expression and rigid posture were a far cry from the warm, compassionate man the community knew. Linda studied him closely. There was a calmness about him, but it wasn't the peace of an innocent man. It was the calm of someone who had already come to terms with his actions. Joseph had been silent during his initial arrest, refusing to speak to anyone. He had requested a lawyer, and while Linda respected his right to remain silent, She knew that the weight of the situation would eventually press him to talk. The question was, when? And what would he say when that moment came? Linda took a deep breath and entered the room, sitting across from Joseph, who looked up with a pair of weary eyes. He didn't flinch when she sat down. There was no surprise, no anger, just resignation. "Pastor Williams," Linda began, "I'm sure you know why you're here." Joseph's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. His hands, folded neatly in front of him, betrayed no emotion. "Your wife, Angela," Linda continued, "was brutally murdered. Her body was dismembered. It's a crime that has shocked this community, and the evidence is pointing directly to you." Still, Joseph remained silent. He wasn't defensive, nor did he seem scared. Linda could tell he was processing the gravity of the situation, weighing his options. She pressed on. "We found evidence of an affair between your wife and Pastor Richard Thomas," Linda said, her voice steady but firm. "Not only that, we've also discovered that your children, all four of them, are his biological children. They don't belong to you." Joseph's eyes hardened for a brief moment, but he still didn't speak. Linda leaned forward, her voice softening, attempting a different approach. "I understand that this is difficult," she said, "but the truth is, we're not here to judge you for what happened between you and Angela. We're here to understand why it ended this way. Why did it come to murder? Why the dismemberment? What drove you to do that?" At this, Joseph finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it was full of bitterness. "She betrayed me," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "She betrayed me in the worst way. I loved her. I loved her with everything I had. And she was with him for years. She gave him my children. And I didn't even know." His voice broke slightly, but there was no tears. His pain seemed more focused on anger than on sorrow. Linda could see the cracks forming in his demeanor. The emotional distance he had put up was starting to crumble, but she knew she had to be careful. This was the turning point, the moment when he might confess. Joseph leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "I wasn't always a good man," he said, almost as if speaking to himself. "But I tried. I gave everything for that family, for the church, for her. And she gave me nothing but lies." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I thought I could forgive her. I thought I could live with it. But when I saw those DNA results, when I saw that none of the kids were mine, I couldn't breathe. I felt worthless." Linda nodded, empathizing with the pain he must have felt. "You found out about the affair, about the DNA. But what made you act the way you did? Why kill her? Why dismember her body?" Joseph's eyes hardened again, his hands trembling as he clenched them into fists. "You don't understand," he said, voice rising. "Richard Thomas took everything from me. He took my wife. He took my children. And he did it right under my nose. I couldn't be a father to them. I couldn't even protect them from the truth." He shook his head, his voice cracking with emotion. "I just couldn't live with that. She lied to me for years, and I couldn't look at her anymore. I had to do something. I had to make it stop." Linda listened closely, piecing together the fragments of his confession. It wasn't just about Angela's betrayal. It was about his deep sense of humiliation and the unbearable weight of not knowing the truth for so long. Joseph felt emasculated, worthless, and incapable of fulfilling the role of father and husband. His need for control, for retribution, had spiraled into a violent rage that had destroyed his family. "I didn't mean to kill her like that," he muttered, almost as if trying to justify his actions. "I just wanted to hurt her. I wanted her to feel what I felt, to understand how much she had taken from me. But once I did it, once she was gone, I couldn't stop." Linda watched him closely, noting the mixture of guilt and anger in his eyes. He wasn't sorry for what he had done, but for the fact that it had come to this. As the days passed, the case against Pastor Joseph Williams grew clearer. He had confessed to the murder of his wife, Angela, and the details of the crime were grim. But Detective Linda Harris knew there was more to the story. The murder wasn't just about betrayal. It was about deep-rooted lies, secrets, in the unraveling of a carefully constructed life. But there was still something missing, something that didn't add up. Linda had learned a lot from Joseph's confession, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play than just the overwhelming pain of infidelity and a shattered family. Joseph had snapped, but why had he snapped in such a brutal way? Why had he gone so far as to dismember Angela's body? Was it really just the betrayal? Or was there something deeper that drove him to his violent actions? Linda's first step was to look deeper into the pasts of both Joseph and Angela Williams. She reviewed old church records, interviewed friends, family members, and colleagues, and even spoke to people from their early lives. Slowly but surely, a pattern began to emerge, one that painted a picture of a man desperately trying to hold on to control in a world that had been slipping away from him for years. Joseph had been an ambitious man, fiercely protective of his reputation and his church. He had built a strong community around himself, but his devotion to his congregation often left little room for his personal life. Angela, on the other hand, had always been more reserved. She had a quiet strength, but her marriage to Joseph had been strained for years. There were whispers among those who knew them that Angela had never truly been happy. She had loved Joseph, but she had also felt suffocated by him. She felt isolated, trapped in a marriage where emotional intimacy had long been replaced by duty and obligation. Linda dug into the details of Angela's relationships, speaking to her friends and family. Angela had confided in a few people over the years about her dissatisfaction in the marriage, though she never said anything directly to Joseph. It seemed Angela had been caught between the life she had built and the life she wished she could escape. Her affair with Pastor Richard Thomas wasn't just about lust. It was a way for Angela to find a sense of freedom, a release from the emotional confinement she had lived with for so long. Richard, in contrast to Joseph, had been a man who offered her validation, attention, and love. But Linda's investigation began to take a darker turn when she uncovered something even more troubling. Angela had kept secrets from Joseph for much longer than he realized. There had been more than just the affair with Richard. There had been several instances of emotional manipulation, deceit, and a string of lies that Angela had woven around her family. Angela had lied about the nature of her relationship with Richard, and in doing so, she had also lied to herself about what she truly needed. Linda learned that Angela had known about the DNA test results long before Joseph ever did. In fact, she had secretly ordered a paternity test of her own, one that had confirmed Richard as the father of all 4 children long before the truth was ever revealed to Joseph. Angela had never intended to tell Joseph. She had known the pain it would cause him, and she had chosen to protect him from it for as long as she could. But Angela had also known that her marriage was slowly deteriorating, and the affair with Richard had only deepened her sense of guilt and conflict. Angela's silence on the matter was another secret she had kept from Joseph, but in some twisted way, it was also a form of protection. Angela had hoped, in some distant corner of her heart, that if she kept the secret hidden for long enough, it would prevent the devastating consequences of her betrayal from coming to light. Linda began to understand the psychological toll this had taken on Joseph. His discovery of the affair and the DNA test results hadn't been the true turning point. It was the realization that Angela had been deceiving him for years, and that the family he had loved, the family he had fought to protect, was built on a lie. His children weren't his. And perhaps, even worse, his love for Angela had been based on a false foundation, one that he had never questioned until the moment the truth came crashing down. But Linda wasn't ready to let Joseph off the hook just yet. There was something nagging at her, something that didn't fit. Yes, Joseph had been betrayed, but he had also known about Richard's involvement in Angela's life. What Linda needed to understand was the exact moment when Joseph had snapped. When had his feelings of betrayal turned into something so violent? What was the catalyst for the rage that led to Angela's dismemberment? As Linda pored over the case files, one small detail caught her eye. A phone call made by Joseph on the day of Angela's murder. The air was thick with tension as Detective Linda Harris walked into the small interrogation room. Pastor Richard Thomas was sitting across from her, his hands folded in front of him, an expression of calm resolve etched across his face. The stoic demeanor of the man who had once been a friend and mentor to Joseph Williams seemed almost rehearsed, like a mask he had worn for years to protect himself from the truth. Linda had already interviewed Richard once, but this time she was ready. She had pieced together enough evidence to know that there was more to this story than a simple affair between him and Angela. Richard Thomas was not just a bystander in this tragedy. He was a key player, perhaps even the catalyst for the violence that had unfolded. Pastor Thomas, Linda began, her voice measured and firm, we know about the phone call you had with Joseph Williams on the day his wife was murdered. We also know that your DNA test confirmed you're the biological father of all four of his children. It seems that your relationship with Angela went much deeper than you've led us to believe. What exactly was said during that call? Richard looked at her, his gaze unwavering. There was no fear in his eyes, but Linda could see the slight shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw. He was hiding something. She could feel it. Detective, Richard said, his voice smooth but with a faint trace of defensiveness. I've already told you everything. Joseph and I have been colleagues, friends even, for years. But Angela, she was a woman in pain. She sought solace in me, and we had an affair. It was a mistake, but it was over. Joseph knew about it. I'm not sure why he chose to hold on to that, but it wasn't my fault. Linda's eyes narrowed. It wasn't just an affair, was it? She asked. This wasn't a brief fling. Angela's children, they're yours, Richard. That's not something you can easily dismiss. Richard hesitated, and for the first time, Linda saw a crack in his composure. He shifted in his chair, looking down at his hands before meeting her gaze once again. I loved Angela, Richard confessed, his voice quieter now, almost regretful. I loved her in a way I shouldn't have, but I also knew she was married. I knew Joseph. I knew what it would do to him. I never wanted to hurt him, but Angela and we couldn't help ourselves. The connection was too strong. Linda could see the conflict in his eyes. The words felt rehearsed, but the emotion behind them seemed genuine. He truly believed that he had been justified in his actions, that he had loved Angela and had been doing what was best for her. But Linda knew better. She had seen enough men in power try to justify their mistakes with emotional manipulation. Why did Joseph call you that day, Richard? Linda pressed. What did you say to him? He found out everything about you, about Angela, about the kids. So why call you? What did you two discuss? Richard's eyes flickered, and for the first time, Linda saw a hint of panic in his gaze. He didn't speak immediately, his thoughts seemingly racing. Linda didn't push him. Instead, she remained silent, letting the tension build. He would break eventually. He had to. Finally, Richard sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping as if a great weight had been lifted. Joseph called me that day because he wanted answers, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted to hear it from me. He had the DNA test results, and he knew the children weren't his. He was broken, Detective. He needed to hear me admit it. Linda leaned forward. So what did you say? I told him the truth, Richard replied, his voice now devoid of any real emotion. I told him that Angela and I had been together, and I admitted that I was the father of the children. He didn't say much after that. He just hung up. I don't know what he was thinking, but I knew he was hurt. I knew he would be angry, and I knew that once the truth came out, there was no going back. Linda studied Richard carefully. His words didn't match his actions. His admission, while seemingly honest, didn't explain the full extent of what had happened. Joseph had been furious, yes, but there was more to the story than just a moment of anger. How did you feel, Richard? Linda asked, her tone shifting to one of quiet curiosity. Knowing what you did to Joseph, knowing that you were not only having an affair with his wife, but also fathering his children? How did you justify that? Richard's eyes darkened, and for the first time, his calm veneer cracked completely. I didn't owe Joseph anything, he snapped. He was my friend, but he didn't know what I was going through. He didn't understand the kind of life I was living. He had his church, his perfect little family, while I had to hide who I was. I was suffocating, Detective. Angela gave me the freedom I needed, and I wasn't going to let that go. Linda was taken aback by the intensity of his response. Detective Linda Harris sat in her office, sifting through the pile of evidence she had collected over the last few days. She had uncovered a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and manipulation, But the full picture was still incomplete. Pastor Richard Thomas had confessed to his role in the affair with Angela Williams, but his involvement went much deeper than just being the biological father of Joseph's children. Linda could sense that there were still more pieces to uncover, and she wasn't going to let Richard or Joseph get away with bearing the truth. The more she thought about it, the more Linda realized that Joseph's confession had been a reflection of something much darker than simple anger over infidelity. His dismemberment of Angela's body, his refusal to take any responsibility for his own actions, and the bitter resignation in his voice had all been signs of a man who had been driven to madness by years of personal and emotional repression. But it was clear to Linda that his actions weren't just a reaction to Angela's betrayal. Something else had pushed him over the edge. Her instincts told her that the true breakdown of the Williams family had started long before the day Joseph found out about the affair. It wasn't just the affair or the children's paternity that had driven Joseph to violence. It was his sense of control slipping away. For years, Joseph had lived with the idea of being the perfect man, the perfect pastor, the perfect husband. But beneath that polished exterior, Linda saw the cracks, the pressure of maintaining a perfect image at all costs. It was a fragile shell, and once it was shattered, Joseph had been consumed by the chaos. Linda decided to take another step back. She needed to look at the bigger picture, the context of the Williams family's life. She revisited interviews with friends, family, and church members. She reviewed old records, church finances, and even the sermons Joseph had delivered over the years. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that Joseph had been living in a constant state of fear. Fear of failure, fear of exposure, and perhaps, most importantly, fear of being seen as weak. His relationship with Angela had been strained for years. Linda had already gathered evidence that Angela had confided in a few close friends about her dissatisfaction with the marriage, but there was something even more troubling. Angela had often spoken about Joseph's temper and his control over every aspect of their life. He had been controlling, not just in their marriage but in every part of their lives. He had demanded that she remain silent about the affair with Richard, not only for the sake of their marriage but also to protect his reputation as a respected pastor. Linda spoke with one of Angela's close friends, a woman named Marissa, who had been one of the few people Angela had trusted with her secrets. Marissa explained that Angela had been trapped in a marriage that had become more about appearances than love. Joseph's insistence on keeping up the facade of a perfect family had driven Angela into Richard's arms. She had needed someone to acknowledge her pain, and Richard had done that. But what really broke Angela, Marissa told Linda, her voice barely above a whisper, was when Joseph found out about the affair. He didn't just get angry, he became obsessed. He started watching her every move. He was convinced that she was going to leave him. He told her he couldn't live without her, that he wouldn't survive the shame. He made her promise to never leave him, even though he knew the truth. He begged her, Linda, begged her to stay, and then he became cold, like a different person. Linda listened intently. The fear that Joseph had been harboring for years was now becoming clear. His obsession with maintaining control over Angela, and by extension, his family, had spiraled into a toxic cycle. Angela's affair with Richard had shattered that illusion, and the fragile grip Joseph had on his life had crumbled. Did Angela ever say anything about leaving him? Linda asked. No, Marissa replied, her eyes downcast. She said she would never leave him because of the kids. She said that even though she wasn't happy, she couldn't destroy their family. But she had made up her mind a long time ago that she wouldn't leave Joseph. She didn't want to break up the kids' lives. Linda felt the weight of Marissa's words. Angela's sacrifice, her unwillingness to break her family apart, even though she had been living a lie, had been part of the reason she had stayed with Joseph. And yet, that very decision had only fueled Joseph's need to control, to keep the life he had worked so hard to build intact. Linda left the conversation with a new sense of understanding. Angela had been trapped, and Joseph's obsession had driven him into a corner. Detective Linda Harris stood outside the interrogation room, her mind swirling with all the revelations from the past week. She had pieced together the tragic and complex tale of Joseph Williams, Angela, and Richard Thomas. She had listened to their confessions, gathered evidence, and connected the dots. But she knew that the final part of the investigation was yet to come, confronting Joseph Williams with the truth. Joseph had already confessed to Angela's murder, but Linda had yet to ask him the questions that mattered most, the ones that would give her a clearer picture of why he had done it, why he had killed his wife, dismembered her body, and lied to everyone who loved her. Linda needed to understand his mind, to unravel the fear and obsession that had driven him to commit such a horrific act. Linda had spent hours reviewing the details of the case. She knew Joseph's movements after the crime, his actions to cover up his tracks, and his repeated calls to Richard. The confession alone didn't explain everything. She needed to get him to admit the whole truth, to open up about the manipulation, the fear, and the control that had defined his marriage with Angela. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door to the interrogation room. Joseph was sitting, slumped in a chair, his hands cuffed to the table. His eyes were downcast, his face pale and drawn. The anger that had once burned in him was now gone, replaced by an eerie calmness. Linda sat across from him, her gaze steady, unwavering. Joseph looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Pastor Williams," Linda began, her voice calm but firm. "We've been over the details of Angela's death, but there's still something we need to understand. I know you were angry, but what I need to know is why you did it. Why did you dismember her body? Why did you go to such extremes to cover up what happened?" Joseph's eyes flickered with something between guilt and frustration. He shifted in his seat, but his hands remained still. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if unsure of what to say. Linda could see the internal battle raging within him. He wanted to talk, to explain himself, but the shame was too much to bear. "I didn't mean to," Joseph said quietly, his voice trembling. "I loved her, Linda. I loved her so much, and she betrayed me. She destroyed everything I had worked for, everything I believed in." He paused, his eyes clouded with emotion. I couldn't let her leave me. I couldn't lose her." Linda leaned forward slightly. "But you didn't just lose her, Joseph. You murdered her. You cut her into pieces. Why?" Joseph's face contorted in pain, as if the words were too much for him to say. "It wasn't just the affair. It was everything. It was knowing that I had been living a lie all these years. Angela, she wasn't just my wife. She was my everything. And when I found out about the affair, I realized that I wasn't even a man to her anymore. She had been sleeping with him, with Richard, and she was going to leave me. She was going to destroy everything." Linda's gaze never wavered. "But why go that far? Why take it to the extreme? Why the dismemberment?" Joseph looked away, staring down at his cuffed hands, his fingers trembling. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't bear the thought of everyone knowing the truth. The truth about the affair, about the kids, about the way she had deceived me. I felt like I had lost everything. My family, my church, my life. And when I saw her there, I saw her face, the betrayal in her eyes. I just snapped. I didn't mean to hurt her like that, but I couldn't think straight. I didn't want anyone to know what she had done. I thought if I could just hide her, if I could just hide everything, I could protect my children. I could protect my image. I could save my life." Linda listened to his words, the heavy guilt in his voice. It was clear that Joseph was still trapped in the delusion that his actions had been justified. His need to protect his image, his fear of being seen as weak or flawed, had driven him to this point. It wasn't just his anger at the affair that had caused the murder. It was his obsessive need to control every aspect of his life. "You say you wanted to protect your children, Joseph," Linda said, her voice soft but pointed. "But in the end, you destroyed everything. You took their mother from them. You took away their father, and now you've left them with nothing but your lies." Joseph's eyes filled with tears as he looked up at Linda. For the first time, Linda saw a flicker of true remorse in his expression. He was broken, not because of the crime he had committed, but because he had realized the magnitude of his actions too late. His obsession had led to a destruction he couldn't undo. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Joseph whispered. I just couldn't face the truth. I couldn't face the fact that everything I believed in, everything I had built, was a lie.